which I'd probably like to start with in terms of this conversation, because it's strategic and it's geopolitical, and blockchain fits into that very well. I've also written on obstructive marketing, which is how other big companies stop other companies doing what they want to do. And I think the third most important tome I've written has been on critical information infrastructures, although that's getting a little old now. So, my focus has been operationally on developing some new RFID approaches, and from an academic point of view, it's been on war, obstructive marketing, and critical information infrastructures. Most recently, I finished a course at Harvard University on cybersecurity, which I'm going to be delighted to make one or two comments about during this discussion.
Love it. Thank you, Maitland. Yes, I have, of course, read all three of your tomes, the last one being fabulous, because exactly as you said, whilst the title is on war, and everybody thinks, oh my God, it must be about war, it's actually about the forms of war and the transition of war. And to your point, how, can you imagine the Department of Defense with blockchain, right? Can you imagine any military engine with blockchain? Yet, as a person who was a very large part of what became AIT ConOps, which is RFID for the Department of Defense, and went through all of the challenges of integrating it in there, you can just see so many positives. It's funny you should mention Kuwait, of course, because, as you know, there's a mound of containers under the sand from some years ago, which I suppose is why the word supply chain doesn't kind of click anymore, which is another issue, of course, that we could talk about it just on that one issue. Why has the supply chain got some challenges? It's the pandemic. Actually, it's because we've come... It isn't, is it, Maitland? What is it? Why is the supply chain crumbling?
Well, I think it comes back to my first point, which is China. So if you'll permit me to launch into a brief discussion on China to set the theme for the top of this discussion from a strategic point of view. I think one of the key things about that we have to realize about China is that it's adopted blockchain in a wholesale manner, but it has banned the use of blockchain for cryptocurrencies. So in 2019, there were 58,990 patents registered by China on blockchain technology. That is an astonishing number. So coming back to your point about the supply chain, China is using blockchain for the supply chain. The most recent example, of course, is its cooperation with Walmart in the United States, whereby the supplies that China are making to Walmart are controlled by a blockchain in a dual partnership. So blockchain is important within the supply chain. But just coming back to China for a moment, in addition to the 58,990 patents, which is roughly 60,000, there are 60,000 cybersecurity graduates per annum in China. Most of those directed towards either cybersecurity or cyber hacking, which, just to put that in context, the new size of the British Army is 60,000 people. So as Stalin said, quantity has a quality all of its own. And whether that's in terms of landmass or in terms of people, then the performance of China, whether it's in the use of the blockchain, the development of blockchain technology, or the use of people to direct blockchain technologies, is way ahead of what's happening in the West. And we should recognize that and get up to speed with it as quickly as possible. If I may just add before you come in, John, I just want to make one or two other quick points. China is also developing a sovereign digital currency based on blockchain. It uses blockchain for medical and health. It's using blockchain for energy. it's using blockchain for supply chain, and in a parallel development, it has, of course, infiltrated things like the Internet Engineering Task Force and many other standard bodies with the strategic objective of dominating standards bodies and ensuring that it has control of both DLT type technologies and developments in the internet sphere going forward. Now, this is war. If you don't get it, it's war. If you look at the most recent strategic documents from China in terms of how it's going to progress warfare, there are 42 different vectors, one of which is land warfare, one of which is sea warfare, one of which is air warfare, and another of which is space warfare. Another one is the internet, another one is blockchain, another one is the Belt and Road Initiative, and so it goes on. By the way, blockchain is really important for the Belt and Road Initiative. It controls the Belt and Road Initiative, and where those countries that have got involved with the Belt and Road Initiative, it also lists, of course, their debt within a blockchain. We could go on and talk about that. So China is seeking dominance via standards, and in terms of its approach to the internet, it's looking for complete surveillance of not only its own population, but people outside China. And I'll stop there.
Yes. Well, first of all, I don't think either of us have any issue with China per se, the Chinese people. I have been there several times. I look forward to going again. I'm a particular fan of a city called Qingdao. It's just very nice and very, very un-Shanghai-ish, if you follow. Secondly, I think you're right in one singular respect, which is, oh my goodness, China mastered RFID very early and became producers of it very early and owners of it very early, whilst others wandered around in order to make itself effective. And of course, that meant knowing where stuff is. They came to RFID. You want to buy some RFID stuff? get out an Alibaba book, and you've got it. Every flavor you need and every type you want. Oh, and you can have it tomorrow. Maybe not right now, because we're back to the supply chain issue. But so that's interesting, as you point out. China's uptake of blockchain in enterprises, very, very matching. It makes the case, frankly, for the discussion today. They had one and they've got, here's the other one, but not to detract from a national ambition or a national objective, simply to point out that perhaps we all should be aware that if you want to know what the next step is, have a look at what China is doing. And having said that, it's good to note that, in fact, you actually can have a national objective, whilst it can be to a person look ominous, as it were. As you point out in your latest book, Maitland, I think I'll give it a Greaves phrase: all empires fail. The question is only how and when. And early in your newest book, you write about basically things that don't work anymore. So my question would be, or my statement would be, you know, technologies expire these days at such an incredible rate, do they not? You know, so when we think, oh my, we're at the cusp of another wave that'll last for decades, etc., will it? In fact, can you, in effect, you know, I'm RFID, I'm enterprise blockchain DLT, I've seen it, I've proven the case time and time again here in the United States and recently in the Netherlands by Zoom. You can't go there. But so when you look at the supply chain issue, Maitland, couldn't the supply chain issue really be supported by our being able to adopt and adapt technologies in a better way? And as such, certain countries will always be able to do it autocratically rather than, through committees. And so I'll leave it there and ask you for your continuing depth, please.
Well, let me just come back and say that there's no implied criticism of China in what I'm saying, because every country has the right to pursue its own strategy. I'm just reflecting what China's strategy is. I think from a Western perspective, we have to be very careful. The West comprises, let's say, less than 1/7 of the number of people in the world. And there's another quantity that has a quality all of its own. And the rest of the world has 6/7. And they follow basically a different political and economic model than the West. And we should be very much aware of that. And we can't criticize it. It's a different way of doing it. We have to be aware of the impact it has on us. So coming to your other points about the supply chain, I think China, on the one hand, needs blockchain and DLT technology to control the supply chains from its supplier perspective. It also needs to control supply chains on those things which it values. Cobalt would be an interesting example to pursue. When we look at the demand side of things, then of course the same applies. The interesting thing for both sides is that DLT technology gives you a visible transfer of evidence and of supply through the chain, which is not always available through other technologies. Now, if we have a confined blockchain, that is with no feeds to it, whether it's a crypto wallet or whether it's RFID, then you have a very secure platform. And when you were referring to the death of IT early on, then one of the things that could cause the death of IT, well, two things could cause the death of IT. One is the implementation of all these patents that China has developed for DLT. And secondly is the amount of cybersecurity breaches which are occurring particularly in large technology companies in Western-oriented countries. This year running around 50%, perhaps, of all companies will suffer some type of cybersecurity breach in Western technology areas. So you've got a bit of a conflict there on the supply chain side, because on the one hand, the people who are supplying it have got very good control through their own technologies of what's going where. But on the other side, the demand side, there's increasing disruption into how it's being received. And although I referred earlier on to the partnership between Walmart and China, it is also, of course, the case that Walmart has suffered very large data breaches from both state and non-state actors. So I'm using China as a bit of an example here, because China almost monolithically on one side is controlling that supply chain with very protected technology, whereas the receivers seem to be increasingly vulnerable because they're not using the same type of technology to its best effect. So following your suggestion, in terms of RFID, China, of course, has developed very good RFID technology. RFID technology contributes to the evidence exchange in the supply chain, and if properly used, is compatible and complementary to blockchain and DLT technologies in a way that improves the efficiency of the whole supply chain. The difficulty is that not everybody uses it. And if people did start to use it, particularly if they match that to some big data analysis of what's going on in the supply chain, then the efficiencies would be accrued over time, both financially and structurally. So there is a question mark in my mind about how effective the cooperation, in particular between governments and private sectors, the private sector is in the United States, in Europe, in Japan, versus that cooperation in China. So on the one hand, you have almost complete understanding from a state perspective of what's going on. And on the other side, as we've just seen from a release by NIST, the United States is a little bit behind in terms of the cooperation and planning of a partnership that allows that integral understanding of what's going on the receiving end of the Chinese supply chain, but also the acceptance of this technology into the supply chains which are actually delivering Western goods outwards. So there is a bit of a dysfunction, I think, there.
I think
in terms of RFID, we can come back to that technology in a minute. I'll let you go.
No, that's fine, Maitland. I think you've summed it up rather well. This is not really, on the one hand, you might use the word domination. Yet on the other hand, you're quite right. The combination of blockchain in enterprises with RFID, if fully implemented, deployed, is much of the solution to the supply chain challenges that we're seeing today, because we know you have excellent figures on patents. How about equally excellent figures that we have on wastage, on brand, I guess we'll go for the word brand dilution. You know, RFID was a very early form of making sure that X garment was authentic or a particular lump of produce was authentic. And most of those early adopters have continued and are flourishing. And of course, apparel is the biggest deployment, funnily enough, of blockchain and RFID. I was recently at a facility of blockchain. They're bringing in RFID. Right now, what they do is they ship their labels to the manufacturer and RFID in the Far East. They're bringing on the garment, ship their labels when they get to the facility manufacturer in the Far East and the UK. They don't have any equipment to read it. It's actually only put on for the benefit of the retailer, who indeed does the checkout with that same tag. So when you get idiosyncrasies like that, they make your point. That, you know, don't blame a person for doing it good. Ask the recipient why they're not doing it good. And then when they reverse the process and are told by a receiving nation, what's this? A bill of lading. Interesting. So brand protection, wastage. You know, you look at, we have applied some forms of RFID inside some small blockchain enterprises today. But there's the divergence you talk about again, Maitland. I love when you start on your divergence things, how to bring them together, because the IT department doesn't consider RFID to be IT, and the warehouse doesn't consider IT to be anything but a pain, and they never seem to do much, and it's always breaking down kind of thing. So how do you, where's the harmonization role that you see? Who's going to do it? Is it going to be the people on this call? Is it going to be a .gov initiative? Say it, sir. Say it.
Well, let me try and take that last point by trying to give you another parallel that's going on.
Thank you.
If we look at the Internet of Things, particularly operational technology, then there was a forecast that this would be, 40 billion devices by this year or next year. But the take-up has been lower than that. And one of the reasons for that, of course, is that IoT devices, excluding RFID, I'll come back to RFID in a moment, are susceptible to cyber attacks. Now, RFID, funnily enough, is somewhat stronger in terms of its defense against cyber security attacks than the later IoT devices. And the reason, of course, for this is much more familiar to you than it is to me, because of its structure and the fact that it's read by a reader, and that reader can either read actively or passively, and the reader itself is really the target of any cybersecurity hack, as opposed to the individual device, whether it's on a pipeline, a piece of apparel, on a medical device, or a health record belonging to an individual. And this parallel between IoT, the new devices, not being taken up too well because of some threats and perhaps some suspicion about how it's going to work. But on the other hand, the very well-developed, well-understood RFID mechanisms, which have, if you can control access to the readers appropriately, less cyber vulnerability than the IoT side. Now, when we took a look at that again in the oil fields, you may remember that we tried to look at IoT devices on oil rigs and discounted them in favor of RFID devices, because not only were they more reliable, they lasted longer, and they were less susceptible to cyber hacking. So my answer to your question from a technology point of view would be, please don't discount RFID. It has a lot going for it. And in terms of its integration with a blockchain or DLT, it's probably more effective than many other devices. Now, in terms of managing brand, as the apparel industry has found, managing your brand by using RFID cuts down on counterfeit operations, and also improves the understanding through the acquisition of data about how fast things are going through the supply chain, how well it's being sold, what's doing well, and so on. We know all that. And we also now know, just from the top of the conversation, that in terms of using blockchain to control supply chains from a Walmart point of view, one way they're getting over recent supply hacks is, and protecting their brand, is to introduce more RFID, not less. I think, does that sufficiently answer that question?
It does, Maitland, and I know that you are very keen on brand protection. Perhaps you can explain to people how many sides to that simple phrase there is. It isn't just about tagging something to make sure it's genuinely whatever. It's all the rest that you have so eloquently written about that undermines, again, economies by dint of flooding them with non-durable product, let's put it that way, or unauthentic product.
Well, I think in this context, maybe we look at something like Brexit. And Britain has recently left the European Union. It's left a whole series of regulations. So the first issue about brand protection is the regulatory one and the standards one. And at the top of the conversation, we commented on standards and the way in which particularly the Chinese are looking to use standards to advance their national brand and independent brands. Now, when somebody like Britain leaves the European Union, it has to start almost all over again in regard to how it uses standards. And that becomes a threat not only to the country, but also to the brands within the country. And you have people like JCB, the tractor makers, you have Formula One, you have some of the big car makers all struggling to work out exactly how they're going to manage certain aspects of regulation and standards going forward. Now they've come out of a well-understood system. And the second thing is the presentation of the brand. No logo is a fairly old book by Naomi Klein, but reflects the fact that the logo defines the business. And you've recently seen all the nonsense over Facebook and Meta, and trying to work out what the brand stands for, where it's going, and what it does. So not getting the brand right in a social media sense is also important. And then there's the fact of the employees, how the employees react. You've got casual employees making difficulties. Then you have competitive issues between different organizations, companies who call themselves similar names but aren't selling the same product. You then have all the counterfeit and authentication issues which come alongside making mobile phones and those sorts of technologies, where you've sort of got 9 for the customer and 1 for me. So you have knockoff apples coming through the black market supply chain, which are exactly the same as our many Rolexes, by the way, as the original product, but come through a different way and demean the product. And we could go on down that sort of route. So there are a large number of different ways in which a brand can be compromised, not least by the fact that its supply chain isn't properly controlled and secured.
And there we are again, controlled and secured supply chains. And to your point, yes, you can have you can have a Rolex, and you can. There's no one really knows the difference except perhaps Mr. Rolex himself, right? We know that one of the great things we can do is surely bring, if as it has been shown in fintech blockchain, regulators and governments move immediately to manage it. Never mind China, all of them have, every single one. And the bottom line is, what if we could get an initiative together that said, for these particular products or these particular use cases, you will, in order to be efficient and to maximize resources which are challenging, you will have an RFID identified X inside a blockchain DLT engine of IT, and all parties will subscribe. Now, you know that'll go down like a lead balloon in some quarters, but isn't that what we're really saying?
Well, that comes back to a couple of points we've already made in this conversation. The first point you made earlier on, which was the death of IT. And the death of IT may be a little premature, but certainly something has to be done to stop the carnage which is currently going on, not only in supply chains, but in businesses as a whole, from cyber attacks. One way of doing that is to introduce a different type of technology. And the most secure technology at the moment is blockchain and DLT. Now, we know that. So the question is, why isn't it being adopted? And there are a number of reasons for that. At the top of the scale is government's attitude. Now, belatedly, as we also mentioned in this conversation so far, NIST in the USA have mandated that the government and the private sector should work closer together to reduce the security risks to both the government and business. Sorry, that's an American-centric comment. But they can't do that unless they properly adopt some of these new technologies. They may not wish to do that because one of the key reasons for the existing system being maintained, particularly in the West, is surveillance. It allows governments to survey what's going on the internet, within e-commerce and within a fintech. If you start putting a barrier in there, all of a sudden, you're not quite sure what's happening. A good example is what happened in Russia. Russia, for many, many years, blocked blockchain. They said you can't use it. But 2 or 3 years ago, they completely revised their opinion. And cynically, you would say they didn't like blockchain in the first place because they wouldn't be able to control all the financial transactions which were going on, which they actually wanted to look at. But if you now look at what's happened in their digital assets legal framework published in 2020, then you will find that blockchain is now accepted, and it's accepted because, like the Chinese, they've worked out a way in which the state can control what's going on in the blockchain, or blockchains, depending on how they're implemented. So there's quite a... Your thought that everybody should adopt it is absolutely right, because it's common sense. Why would you do it any other way? Why would you deliberately not install the best possible controls? So let me just comment on risk appetite.
Yes, sir.
One of the key issues for businesses is how they manage risk. So at the moment, nothing is managed by risk appetite. So let us assume for a moment that you're going to introduce a system into your business, a new IT system or a new blockchain type system. What does the board sit down and do? Well, it certainly doesn't sit down and work out whether a blockchain or a new IT system is going to be used in general, because they're going to leave that to the so-called specialists. But the problem is that these technologies are now so important that they become mainstream board issues. On every board, there should be the competence to deal with these sorts of decisions. So if you were looking at risk, and I'll just use data as an example, if the board was looking at the risk in its business from a rational point of view, it would say we have no risk appetite for our data to be breached. So therefore, the data would be put in a fortress, which cannot be accessed. At the same time, they would say we have a great risk appetite for talking to customers or potential customers. And therefore, our risk appetite in terms of IT systems, CRM systems, customer relationship management systems, is very high. But if you look at usual infrastructure of companies and businesses, you won't find them split off in that type of risk appetite way. But if each business did approach its IT systems in a risk appetite manner, it would immediately see that for its financial structures, for its supply chain structures, and if it was in the health business, its HIPAA compliance structures, it would immediately adopt both a blockchain or DLT approach and RFID. It's common sense. But they don't look at it like that. And boards, as we've seen from the resignations of the number of CEOs from Walmart, Anthem, and others, they don't understand it.
And that's interesting again, because you're absolutely right. They should, but the board kind of delegates it. And here's where you run into a problem. I've run into it for years with RFID. I'm in the same substructure now with blockchain. I'm running into exactly the same angst, as it were, which is in RFID, it was, where's the ROI? Well, what about your current losses? That's why you asked us to come in and look at RFID for you. Oh, yeah, but, they're only 2 million a year. You're asking us for 2 million to put this in. Yeah, but that's the one time, and you'll immediately stop the issues that you have. Oh, I don't know about that. Well, the blockchain is the same issue. How do we restructure and re-engineer our whole process? So some phrases have been coined by myself over the last couple of years, which have been very kindly taken up by the industry at large. You're well aware of one of my RFID ones, and I've moved it over because it's the Ohio principle, which is zero human intervention operations. Every company needs it because the worst mistake in the company is made by the individual employee and their level of interest or apathy to their current process. So in blockchain, we've developed platform, what it runs on, and process, what it runs for. And don't confuse the two. The IT form is platform. Process is when someone says, you will now get a digital ledger that looks like this, that is your entire sourcing string, shipping string, receiving string, everything, including the timelines. Once you breach any form of that process in blockchain, you render the contract void, which in and of itself is fabulous. You also, when you think you can do things, and I'm watching them being done now, where the supplier of the yellow T-shirts is told to use a particular yellow, but they can't get it, so they just use a nearly the same yellow. Sorry, contract's voided, because why? You saw the nearly yellow being delivered to them against that blockchain match. So, oh my goodness, you do in effect, of course, and there's where we get the resistance, as you can imagine, Maitland. You do in effect take a control over entities and enterprises that is sometimes, if not often, unwelcome, because we come up against the old guard. More than my job's worth. Esther Ransom, a long time ago, but still the guardian phrase. And so, with that said, Maitland, we've trawled across these things. We've said these things in concert. How do we explain to these good people listening to us and those who will listen to this in due course? How do you carry it forward? Do you send a letter to NIST? Do you send a letter to the government? I was recently involved in a National Health Service RFP for a COVID vaccination identity for their staff. And during the bidders conference, as not me, another party in there from another company said, but what about blockchain as part of this? And they went, oh no, we don't see any need for that.
Well, let me just come back. Let me just come back on your last point first, if I may, and then yes. I'll work back up your conversation. The first point is that the NHS is a digitally dysfunctional organisation. You can go on any trust website and you will almost always find a Trojan. They were caught napping by the ransomware WannaCry event a year or two ago. And the issues from that WannaCry event have not been remediated. So anybody from the NHS who's commenting on the need or otherwise for blockchain probably doesn't know, if you pardon my language, his arse from his elbow. And I say that as having been a previous senior manager within very senior manager within the NHS. So there is the biggest issue, I think, to face from the NHS point of view is probably that of personal privacy, because the blockchain can solve the whole WannaCry ransomware confidentiality issue on health records almost overnight if people were willing to look at it in a particular light. So that's the first thing, is coming back on NHS. I think blockchain is particularly appropriate to health, particularly during a pandemic. It could sort of resolve a large number of the problems which exist on both tracing zero patients, infected zero patients, and also making sure that the right people are being vaccinated at the right time, and being effective in protecting the staff of the NHS in particular. So let me just leave that one for a moment and come back to a couple more of your points. Why should the boards adopt this sort of technology? Well, the first thing is their share price. Because as soon as they get attacked, their share price tanks, goes down. Absolutely. And you've just got to look at the victims of attacks on cyber attacks on companies to understand that. The second, of course, is that if they're in a merger and acquisition mode, then it reflects on the price paid for the company. And that was particularly the case with Yahoo when it was being taken over by Verizon. It cost them $500 million, the attack. Not the attack cost them a lot of money, but there was actually a $500 million reduction in the price paid for Yahoo over and above the initial offer. So that's the second thing. And so the third thing is probably to work out what's called a return on mitigation. If you mitigate risk, and if you are coming back to this question of risk appetite again, if you mitigate risk, then you can actually measure a return on it if you're approaching the whole business from a risk perspective. And the return on mitigation from by turning to something like blockchain and RFID for certain particular types of industries, in particular energy, medicine, health, finance, can be quantified, because we can see what happened before and we can see what's happened afterwards from existing businesses and say, well, there is we can actually quantify the difference here, and that would have a bit immediate impact on your share price. So it's not correct to say that we can't sort of suggest that there's a price to be a price return or a benefit to be accrued from implementing blockchain. I think that's true. It can be done. It's a bit like having some of the issues we talked about earlier about brand management. These things always have an impact on share prices. And the use of blockchain and RFID can, in a similar way, be shown to protect the brand, protect the share price at an immediate cost, no doubt, which is slightly higher than the board may want to pay, but at the same time it reduces the overall risk that the company or organisation is facing. So I think that's the way. I think that's the way to approach it. So I think that if you look at the cost of ransomware in any business, you can. It's the cost of implementing something like blockchain disappears like a drop in the ocean, doesn't it?
I think it was one of the mega survey companies, maybe 18 months ago, carried out a survey of the top 10,000 corporations with a very simple question: who looks after your cybersecurity? Way too many of them said, "Oh, I think that's Maureen in data supplies." Okay, cool. I noticed the report vanished quite quickly, but that's 18 months ago. You and I both know that the erosion of data security is daily, not 18 monthly. As a result of which, however, as our closing comment for today for the audience, Maitland, one of the things we've come up against, thank you for lauding RFID readers and tags as being a secure infrastructure or a more secure infrastructure than the general IT or IoT models. But I'm sorry to have to say to the community that one of the things we're running up against is that the current readers, no matter in what sector, whether they're wireless healthcare devices or portable monitors of patients, or whether they're in a warehouse or whatever, they can't deal with blockchain data. It's too dense. The concatenated data string overwhelms them, and parsing it defeats the entire purpose of the blockchain. You don't take a piece out and give it over here. You have to really maintain the integrity of the record. So I'm on a couple of working groups where we're pushing to say, okay, manufacturers, but here we go again, Maitland, bringing us in a beautiful full circle. The manufacturers turn around and say, well, it's the regulations, you see. We're not allowed to do that.
Well, we didn't get down to the technical issue, but if we just put this in terms of the IEEE, then the first thing is that there is a national issue. And the national issue is to ensure that these things become joined up. The second thing is the regulations and standards. And it's imperative that organisations like the IEEE maintain their independence and maintain their independence from outside interference, particularly from state bodies. And it's equally important now, you've sat on standards bodies, I've sat on standard bodies in the oil and gas industry, that the committees which are involved in looking at this wake up. They need to wake up to the threats that there are to the integrity of technical development within their own purview. So, for example, in USA technical companies, they also need to wake up to the fact that things can save developments, appropriate standards and regulations can save businesses and the government money when appropriately deployed. And perhaps finally that when doing that, the advantages of big data can be properly gathered, and as a consequence, improved efficiencies across the piece can be delivered.
Thank you. I would ask if it's all right for you, I'm going to put your email address into the chat box, along with perhaps you would like to, rather than me, if you have the chat button handy, and just put an everyone message with your email address and the title of your book, please. The email address is, the chat box is that round circle with the white thing over to the right as you look at the screen on the bottom toolbar.
Yeah,
super. Thank you very much, Maitland. While Maitland deals with that, which is very important, those of you who really want to get a hold of him, which you should, and explore the situation more, and then you should read his book, which, believe me, is as much RFID as everything else in the world. In the moment, though, are there any questions? If you have a question, please type it into the chat box, or simply unmute yourself and say, hey, this is Francesco, I want to ask you about, etc. Or, hey, this is Larry. We'll work out the batting order from there. So questions, please, in either form. Interesting. We seem to have quietened the crowd, Maitland, which I guess, no, here we go. Ranga's here. Yes, go ahead, sir.
So I have a question. I have been associated with RFID for close to 15 years. And we still seem to have a lot of problem with data security and privacy issues, compliance issues, and with throwing blockchain into the whole thing. Are we going to increase that problem, or are we going to reduce the problem?
Well, I think from a simple perspective, we're going to reduce the problem.
I think, Ranga, you have to take on board it's a problem reduction model for any enterprise, large or small, and for, incidentally, people. One of the great struggles going on at the moment is, contactless cards are the usual, but contactless cards infrastructure is legacy. And so what you've got, you've got an RFID-enabled contactless card, but you've got a legacy piece of software running it that itself is exposed. Hence, you can get these massive card security frauds that it's not your card that caused the issue, it's the system. Yeah. To Maitland's point, you see, about the card itself is cool. The system is not cool. It's not legitimate. Doesn't work. To your point, Ranga, I remember in RFID, been in it a bit longer than yourself. I'm not saying I've been in it too long, but I started by fitting RFID tags to Julius Caesar's chariots. And I think that gives you a clue. But the bottom line is that we also ran into the privacy issues, as you know. We ran into enterprise awareness. We ran into incumbents without wanting to change. I just remember, though, how funny it is. I was in a paper warehouse some years ago now, and they were considering RFID, but at this moment in time, they had barcodes which hung over the aisles where the big paper rolls were stored, and they had barcodes on the paper reels. And the guy was getting off his forklift and going up to scan with a handheld barcode scanner the location. Then he scanned the paper reel. Then he picked it up and moved it to another location. And then he scanned the barcode label on the paper. And then he scanned the location sign. So after a while, I came over and I had a suit on. And he said, "Oh, yeah, what do you want?" And I said, "Why are you doing that?" He said, "Well, we do that because it shows we took it from there and we put it over there." I said, "But your scanner's not working." He said, "Oh, are you from corporate?" I said, "No, I'm just looking." And he said, "How do you know?" I said, "Because you can tell the light doesn't come on." And you see, they did put RFID in, I'm very pleased to tell you, in Tennessee, as a result of my observations in the report, right? And it's actually brilliant, because Matthias has asked a great question that stops my war stories, as it were, to which I have experience in both of those and the interaction. You're absolutely right. It's a more secure container for the data, but what happens if the RFID transponder itself transmits the wrong data? Would you believe, Matthias? That's a blockchain solution. Because if it's not correct, the blockchain will just reject it. It will never allow it in the first place. But Maitland, I'm sure you've got a more robust response than my few words on that subject.
Well, no, not really. I can only agree with you there, John. But the only addition I would make is that we've got to be a little bit careful about looking at any data losses from RFID and sort of transferring that to a problem with the system. In my experience, the problem is normally elsewhere. And just as most data breaches are caused or have been caused historically by a lack of patching, by a lack of patching, then you will normally find that any issues over the loss of RFID data is down to patching somewhere in the system and not specifically about the system itself. So because the whole thing comes together, we have to remember to apply the same standards of discipline to the system as we would expect to see elsewhere. The second point is that in terms of data management of RFID, there have been great strides made about how this is managed. And there is a company, for example, Meridian Data, which links RFID data to a big data and analytics system. And that seems to, so far, contain a lot of these issues. So if you patch the system and control the overall system correctly, which is actually, of course, easier if you're using blockchain, and you link that to an appropriate big data analytics system, then some of these issues can be contained.
Thank you, Maitland. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we all have to go, as we have another engagement in 1 minute, in fact now, which I'm hosting, so I have to open it, which is challenging. Thank you very much for turning up. Thank you very much for listening. Maitland, super big thank you. Look forward to sitting with you at face-to-face in the near future. It would be fabulous, but I think we'll have to allow more than an hour for you and I. It's going to be a long one. See you then, everybody. Thank you very much. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.